Hello, everybody. Welcome to this online webinar. We will wait 1 more minute to give everybody a chance to log in, and we will start the webinar within 1 minute. Thank you very much for joining us. Good afternoon. Welcome to everyone to this webinar on the implications of human rights and sustainable development due diligence, which takes place in the context of a side event of the Summit for a New Global Financing Pact, currently taking place in Paris. We are joined today by a distinguished group of speakers. Before I introduce them to you, I want to say a few brief words as an introduction to this webinar. The goal of the summit is to enhance cooperation among the international community in the face of a threefold challenge of poverty, climate change, and the erosion of biodiversity, by uniting as many partners as possible around a common roadmap. It aims to collectively rethink the global financial architecture of international solidarity, and the summit aims to establish a sufficiently robust and effective international financial architecture to provide greater resources, protect the most vulnerable countries from new challenges and developments, and help them achieve the sustainable development goals. In the context of new developments, new human rights and sustainable due diligence measures are taking an important place. Indeed, several countries are currently developing norms and legislation to ensure human rights and sustainable development due diligence in their supply chains. This process will positively impact the global south, notably by preventing serious human rights violations and environmental abuses. But it will also present challenges for companies and other partners to engage in most vulnerable countries where requirements might be very hard to meet with regard to the due diligence measures. It's especially relevant to address these implications in the context of the new Global Financing Pact, since the developments will have financial implications which will need to be considered by the different parties. Promise become a very interesting webinar with participants from many different countries around the world. And we want to organize this webinar also in an interactive manner. So if you have questions from the panelists, you can send them to us via the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window, and we can feed them in the discussion. This webinar is a joint organization of the World Bank Working Group on Human Rights and Sustainable Development, coordinated under the World Bank Global Forum on Law, Justice and Development, the French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs, which supports the Working Group on Human Rights and Sustainable Development, and the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies, of which I am the Deputy Director. The Working Group on Human Rights and Sustainable Development explores the legal, policy, and operational links between human rights and sustainable development, with a focus on the Sustainable Development Goals. And through a series of activities, we actually want to promote discussion, exchange of knowledge and information on the topics related to human rights and sustainable development. And we aim to create an exchange of best practices. This webinar forms a part of a series of webinars on which we want to discuss relevant topics. It's now my great pleasure to introduce to you the speakers of today. We will first have some welcoming remarks, and then next we will move to a panel discussion. The welcoming remarks will be provided first by Ambassador Delphine Bourillon. She's French Ambassador for Human Rights. Next, Dr. Louise Accord, who is the Global Director for Social Sustainability and Inclusion in the World Bank's Financial Development Practice Group, will offer her opening remarks. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And dear colleagues, dear friends, I'm delighted to introduce this online debate on the implications of human rights due diligence for developing countries and financing development, organized within the framework of the new Global Financing Pact. I'm sorry we are not in front of the Eiffel Tower, but I hope you all come for another occasion to Paris. Actually, promoting and protecting human rights is a priority of France's external action and development policy. In line with this priority, France adopted an innovative and ambitious strategy to integrate a human rights-based approach to development, which is aimed at making its development cooperation policy a tool for the universal promotion and protection of human rights, whether they are civil, political, economic, social, or cultural. In a global context where the space for civil society is becoming increasingly restricted and the universality of human rights is called into question, France supports the rule of law and individual freedoms through development aid and reaffirms the inseparable link between the realization of human rights and sustainable development. France defends this approach in all multilateral fora and works closely with national and local authorities, civil society, and the private sector to defend and protect human rights everywhere in the world. In particular, France is a pioneering country for responsible business conduct and has developed a comprehensive legal framework, the SMART mix, to support human rights due diligence in the private sector. Back to 2017, France was the first state in the world to adopt mandatory rules on corporate duty of care, which is a benchmark for European partners and for the EU. French companies are bound by the duty of diligence with regard to violations of human rights, social rights, occupational health and safety, and the environment, in accordance with the provisions of this law, which is the only one of this kind in the world. France called for the draft European Directive on company sustainability due diligence during its presidency of the Council of the European Union last year. And we advocate for an ambitious and operational due diligence framework at the European level. We are very happy to see that the European Union is taking action and developing strong legislations for due diligence that will contribute to the transition of the Union economy towards a more sustainable model. In addition, we know that other norms and legislation are being developed on human rights due diligence as well. They will have a tremendous positive impact for the Global South by preventing serious human rights violations and environmental abuses. They will also present challenges for private sector engagement in vulnerable countries where investments are needed, but requirements may be harder to meet. It is therefore important to have this discussion around the implication of human rights due diligence in the framework of the summit of the new Global Financing Pact hosted by France today and tomorrow. It seems better fight inequality, promote sustainable development, finance the climate transition are absolutely key to address the current challenges and build our world of tomorrow. I would like to thank the World Bank for organizing this discussion with us, and in particular the Working Group on Human Rights and Sustainable Development of the Global Forum on Law, Justice and Development. We fully support the fundamental work of this group that aims at exploring and promoting the links between the achievement of human rights and the Sustainable Development Goals. I wish to thank you for your attention and now give the floor to Dr. Louise Code, Global Director, Social Sustainability and Inclusion Global Practice. I wish you all a very great debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and hello to everyone. And thank you, Axel. And I'd like to also thank the French government, and particularly the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and our colleagues at Louvain, and of course within the World Bank, our colleagues in the legal department who are part of this partnership that the Ambassador mentioned that made today possible. The working group, as we heard from Axel in his opening, focuses on the legal and policy and operational links between human rights and sustainable development. And if you look at the charter of the working group, it aims to particularly focus on SDG 16, which, let me read, is about promoting peaceful and inclusive societies, providing access to justice for all, and building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. And moreover, it goes on to say that people everywhere should be free from fear of all forms of violence and feel safe to go about their lives, whatever their ethnicity, faith, or sexual orientation. To me, this is a great mandate, but it's a large mandate. And for us, it's part of our social sustainability mandate with a focus on inclusion, access to markets and services for all, a focus on resilience, being able to cope with shocks, but also being safe and free from violence, having access to societies that are cohesive, where there's trust and you're able to come together to address collective challenges. And finally, something we call process legitimacy, which is where decisions are taken in a way that is accountable and transparent and participatory, and all have access to the policy arena. This is a lofty set of goals, but never has it been more important to place a social agenda, to place the human rights agenda, to address today's challenges around climate and around conflict and recurrent pandemics and exclusion. Often we look to the public sector to put the policies and programs in place. But what I'm really seeing increasingly from my work at the World Bank and our partnerships is the incredible role that the private sector can play in advancing this agenda of social sustainability, in advancing the agenda of human rights, and this concept of due diligence for developing countries. There is a huge entry point that we are seeing along what we call the environmental and social framework, or environmental and social governance. Our ESF framework that governs World Bank projects, investment projects, and the IFC performance standards that govern how the practices and behaviors of the private sector firms that benefit from the IFC and MIGA are very much aligned with human rights principles. In fact, they were drawn from human rights principles. And what we are doing now is scaling up at a major level our support to countries and to the private sector to strengthen these principles. Principles around stakeholder engagement and grievance redress mechanisms, that's voice, which is so critical, and participation. Principles around fair labor market standards, no child labor, occupational health and safety. Principles around free and prior informed consent when working with Indigenous communities, which is becoming increasingly a challenge as we seek to expand solar farms and mining of lithium and cobalt and other new minerals that are often in the hands of Indigenous communities. Universal access, non-discrimination, these principles are all part of the ESG framework and our particular work on ESF. And at the World Bank, we're now scaling up, working as a team to develop better metrics on the social side, which is clearly very closely linked to the human rights angle. We've gotten better metrics on the environment side, but we need to have metrics on outputs and outcomes for the private sector, for government policy, who sets the regulatory framework and the implementation capacity, and to make these metrics available to the private sector and to risk rating agencies so that they influence capital flows and provide incentives for governments who are sovereign lenders and put out green bonds or social bonds, and the private sector to enhance their access to much needed finance as we deal with today's global and national challenges. So for us, there's a huge opening that we've not seen before to really take the human rights concepts and principles into the private sector. the growth of sustainable finance is really creating a new environment where we can all function and move on this agenda. There's also a large research agenda that we're taking forward and looking to partner around what is ensuring to show the impact that companies that have good ESG principles perform better, access capital at lower rates, that countries that put into place regulatory frameworks that protect basic human rights and around private sector and public sector activity actually have better access and more lower cost access to international capital. So the large agenda in setting the metrics, a large agenda in building country capacity and regulatory frameworks, a large agenda in working with the private sector to help them meet these standards, working with sovereigns to understand how they can take advantage of this to emit bonds and fundraise and access funds. And finally, the research agenda to make sure that we're on the right track and that we are doing, in a sense, the best possible, combining human rights, social sustainability principles, and economic development with environmental sustainability, because it's that partnership that we need to address today's challenges. So let me just close by saying that right now, a lot of the attention is on where is the money going to come from and the quantity of money and how are we going to raise it. But what I'm really proud to be part of this event, it's about the quality of the spending and making sure that the resources are used to advance principles of sustainable development and human rights. 30 years from now, when we look back, I'm hopeful that we will have seen that we've averted some climate disasters, but we know we also want to make sure that we've narrowed the gaps of exclusion and inclusion, that we've addressed the poverty challenges that are before us, and done so in a way that is sustainable and respectful of human rights and social sustainability. So with that, I'm really excited to hand this back. I think this is a great discussion and incredibly timely on the eve of the Macron Summit. Thank you so much. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kaur. Thank you very much, Ambassador Borreon, to frame this webinar and this debate in a broader context and also, let's say, a daunting agenda for the future, but one which we need to address. And of course, the issue of due diligence is currently very much on top of the agenda. We coming from Europe notice that every day following the debates. And now it's, I think, an interesting time to delve a little bit deeper into this development on due diligence. And for this, we have a great panel of speakers who will introduce from their perspectives the concept of due diligence, but mainly also some of the challenges, opportunities offered by this approach. We know, especially from our perspective, that due diligence is currently very much on top of the political agenda, both in terms of general laws and legislations on human rights and sustainable development due diligence, but as well as applications in sector-specific areas. To delve deeper into this debate, as I said, we have a great panel of speakers. We have Mr. Alan Jorgensen from the Responsible Business Conduct Center of the OECD, and the OECD has been very much on the forefront of the debates, the thinking, the development, implementation, and let's say further development of the concept of due diligence. Next, we will have Mr. Antoine Madeleine, who is Advocacy Director of the Fédération Internationale des Droits Humains, a very leading civil society organization in the field of human rights, and also a very important actor in current debates on the human rights due diligence. And then finally, Ms. Vidya Rangan will provide her perspectives from the ICL Alliance. And the ICL Alliance is a leading organization bringing together leading multi-stakeholder initiatives, which are in the forefront of a lot of the discussions currently on the implementation of due diligence and let's say the really translation of the concept of due diligence down the supply chains. We will first have Mr. Alan Jorgensen presenting, then Mr. Antoine Madeleine, and then Vidya Rangan. Just to remind you, if you have questions, feel free to add them in the Q&A box at the bottom, and then we can feed them into the discussion. Mr. Jorgensen, I want to give you the floor first.
Thank you very much, Axel. Thank you to the organizers indeed for having this very timely discussion here today that I'm very pleased to be part of, and also thank you for the excellent opening remarks from the two previous speakers. Indeed, it is a very timely discussion now, as I think was also expressed by the leaders taking place in the summit this week. We are at a crucial time. 2030 is 7 years away. That's 84 months. We are walking backwards for the first time in several decades on some of the key social development, human development indicators in the 2030 agenda. We are also not on track, of course, to halve global GHG emissions as we should be by 2030. The OECD firmly believes in the capacity and the necessity of open markets based on human rights, rule of law, and with strong environmental protection to help us address these challenges. The power of markets and companies, investors, is transformative. And for that purpose, responsible business conduct and a level global playing field on the alignment of business conduct with these development priorities is absolutely essential. So this is really a key moment to be having this discussion. I think the good news as we talk about a new Global Finance Pact, and we are also increasingly talking about let's say, revamping the global trading system to be more fit to deliver on some of the development challenges that we are facing. The good news in that is that we do actually have a lot of tools in the toolbox. We have very robust and universally supported standards. And here, of course, I'm thinking not only on the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, which embody really the full spectrum of ESG issues, including human rights, labor standards, but also, of course, environment, science and technology development, as well as market conduct, including bribery and corruption. I'm also thinking, of course, on the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. So we do have a global consensus on what responsible business conduct means. And we have a very powerful, I think, uptake already in both business practice in the real economy and in the financial sector. And as we heard from the previous speaker, we also have a lot of leadership in the public sector to really incentivize the right kind of business conduct to deliver the quality trade, the quality finance, the quality investments that we need. So you mentioned the due diligence, the concept of due diligence. Why is it important, and why is it also transformative? I mean, it's a fairly simple idea. It's the idea that all companies, regardless of size and sector, should have the capacity to assess and address whatever adverse impacts they may have on people or planet, and that they should be in that context taking into account international standards for addressing those impacts. This is really the crux of the matter, and this is something we are, of course, seeing a great deal of interest in. It is not a concept that asks and expects companies to be perfect from day one. It is a test of means, and it's an ongoing process that most companies will be familiar with. We're now in a context of course, seeing increasing efforts to translate the concept of due diligence into more legally binding measures, or at least policy measures, including through a smart mix. There is a lot of, you can say, support for the concept of the smart mix in general. The push from regulators cannot stand alone, and we need also sustainability initiatives, collective actions in the private sector to really walk in step with the general direction of policy. And since we are speaking from a developing country perspective, or at least a development perspective, I think it's important to remind ourselves, and we've said this many times in 2015, that the SDGs are not a developing country agenda, they're a development agenda. And in that agenda, all countries are to some extent developing countries. We can look at it from the perspective of different trading partners in the supply chain, whether it be net exporting or net importing countries, that there is a sustainable consumption and production agenda that is very, very important for high-income countries, that also has great effects on low and middle-income countries. So I think this idea that this is a common agenda, and responsible business conduct and due diligence is a common agenda that needs to be inclusive of all actors in the supply chain is very, very important to keep in mind. And I would just actually, before I close, offer three sort of overall points and what I think is important to keep in mind going forward, to make sure that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater as we become increasingly, you can say, systematic about these efforts. We have to remember that responsible business conduct and due diligence is a tool that is built for progress through engagement. It is not a tool that is intended in any way to stop trade and investment. We do live in an imperfect world, and companies do business in an imperfect world. So it's important that we retain this principled pragmatism. Open trade has done more for poverty reduction and human rights than perhaps any other measure in history. And we need that to happen with even greater quality. So very much the engagement approach is key to retain. We have to also then make sure that what we're doing on the ground works for developing countries. We have very interesting experience from many years working with responsible mineral sourcing from some of the world's poorest regions. I can give an example from the DRC, where we are actually seeing through our data that in the areas, in the mining areas where businesses have really implemented responsible business conduct due diligence, we're seeing 30% less interference by armed groups. We're seeing 60% improvements in public service provision by local governments. So it's really important that responsible business conduct due diligence is not just a management tool, but also something that really develops and delivers impact on the ground. We have to measure the right things. We're seeing a lot of interest in, of course, ESG, sustainable investing, there it's important that, as was highlighted by the previous speaker, that we get the metrics right. Responsible business conduct is an engagement tool that is forward-looking and not backward-looking, and there we're actively working to see if we can develop better metrics together with investors to really get it right. What are we measuring? We're talking a lot about trillions of investments going into the ESG marketplace, being invested according to sustainability factors. If we look at the 40 trillion or so in public equity, about a third of that is invested under approaches that we know as negative screening or controversy-based screening, which is typically something that penalizes high-risk sectors and high-risk regions. So there, making sure that we measure the right things as we scale up ESG investing will be very, very important. Secondly, as we build these standards and practices into supply chains, it's going to be important that we do so in a way that really also puts a light on the business models of different actors in the supply chains, rather than pushing down requirements and standards into the upstream supply chain. So responsible business conduct there really asks all participants in the supply chain to look at their purchasing practices and their business model. And this is, of course, something that is going to be particularly important also in the green transition. Let me end on a point echoing the previous speaker as we look at the Global Pact for Financing, and we talk about the trillions that are needed to achieve the SDGs and the Paris temperature goals. We mustn't lose sight of the fact that the world is awash with cash. The total global financial assets number in the hundreds of trillions. Global trade is worth maybe 30 trillion annually. So really what we have to think about as we talk about mobilizing financing for development is really mainstreaming more sustainable and responsible practices into mainstream business and mainstream finance, so that we not only mobilize new money, but also change the way that existing money is really used and allocated. So Axel, let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jorgensen. Thank you very much for setting the scene, also going into details on some of the current developments. I would now like to hand over the floor to Mr. Madeleine to provide his perspective. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And yes, our perspective, in fact, is one of a international human rights organization working with 180 human rights organizations in the field, identifying challenges in the field of human rights, and notably, and I should take back Louis Cord's questions and comment on how will we do development, how will we answer the financial crisis. And I'd like to start by giving an example. Present in this summit in Paris is the King Saud of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who, amongst the other his other news, is here also to present a NEOM project. I'm not sure whether everyone is familiar with the NEOM project. It's a new tech city which Saudi Arabia is intending to build, which will host the 2029 Asian Winter Games, and which, according to its planners, will be powered solely by renewable energy, sustainably connected, surrounded by nature, and will also make sure that the surrounding nature will also be regreened and rewilded. So we have here a green, climate-friendly Disneyland that is being presented to the international community as a tool of progression. But the darker side, unfortunately, of that project, and this is also the information that is being put forward by Al-Qast, the human rights organization of Saudi Arabia that is working with FIDH, is that the leaders of the Al-Huwaiti community, the local community working and living on the location where the plan would be developed, three leaders, Shadli, Ibrahim, and Ataullah, have been sentenced on October 2nd to death penalty, simply for having refused to be forcibly evicted from their home to make way for the NEOM project. Successively to these three condemnations, two women were later sentenced to 34 and 45 years, respectively. What was their crime? They were publishing critical tweets of the government project. So how will we do the development is at the heart of the answer that we provide to this paradigm that I'm presenting, wherein a very green project, in fact, has very poor human rights records. And when we take a broader picture of what is the poor human rights record of such development projects, we count within FIDH in the Observatory for the Protection of Human Rights Defenders, which we have put in place to document attacks against human rights defenders around the world. We count more than 300 assassinations of people who have been killed because they were defending rights, their own rights or the rights of their own communities. And the 2/3 of those assassinations were for activists who were defending environmental rights or development, defending communities against development or economic development projects. So in this context and in this dark context, due diligence indeed provides an answer if it is tailored appropriately. And we've had examples indeed with the UN Guiding Principles, with the OECD guidelines, as well as with the French law, which we mentioned. And there is an upcoming stream to develop legislation at the European level, or even at the United Nations level, or in Latin American countries, something that we are extremely active in monitoring to make sure that these standards are efficient. And the reason why we're attentive is because the way these standards would be designed can make a difference. And the practice that we have seen as FIDH in seeing how due diligence has been implemented has shown whether yes or no, the tool is useful or useless. There are three essential elements that we have been documenting, and that they're the heart of the policy that have to be put in place. The three elements which have been mentioned by my predecessors are free and prior informed consent, the necessity that the engagement in due diligence is made to prevent negative impact, and the notion of the prevention has to be taken into account. And the third one is the access to remedies that it would provide. So I will enter into those three elements, to detail how respectively they are extremely important if they are taken seriously. Firstly, the free and prior and informed consent is an obligation for companies in the field to engage with local stakeholders to make sure that they participate in the decision-making for the project that is being developed. And when we do so, when we say so, we have to stop and look at who are we talking about and what do we mean by participation. And this is where the difference indeed makes a policy positive or useless. Who? We have traditionally, and companies have traditionally been engaged with trade unions, and that they have a history for doing that. Gradually, international NGOs have been also interlocutors of those entities. We've mentioned as well indigenous communities as rights holders and of interlocutors also of project developments. But in fact, the affected communities as a whole of any development project should be consulted. And when we look at these communities as a whole, it's extremely complex to identify what is a community. It's not a unique, those communities are very diverse. The people have different interests also in a possible project. And to say, to use one particular example is the role, for example, of women as opposed to men in certain communities where they may or may not be in a position to receive money to manage the households. So when the companies will engage into free and prior consent, it's important that they take all these specificities into consideration when they engage with those stakeholders. And then what do we mean by free and prior informed consent in addition to who? It's an element that is an engagement throughout the process of a design of a project, from the design through the implementation, through the measurement of its impact, understanding the various delays in the project, providing significant information to the community for them to understand what is going to happen, in order for them to actually form part in a full full project. One example of such experiences that we have accompanied in Brazil was how, for example, a community was being relocated, unfortunately following a court decision, to be provided relocation into another area, and where the community, in fact, was involved in designing the whole village where they would be relocated and actually form part in the whole relocation process. So this is the type of engagement that is necessary in such a context. The second pillar is to prevent negative impact. And when we think about that, what does that mean? It means that the corporations will have to engage in documentation and receive documentation on all sorts of impact, in particular on human rights impact or environmental impact, which is not necessarily what they have in their own initial tool. And this is where the engagement with other actors is necessary. And to look at the notion of the prevention of negative impact is looking at it in a proactive way, meaning that there are decisions that have to be taken. And when I look at these elements, this is something that I want to highlight as opposed to a vision that is seen by some companies or legislators as only a way for companies to draw a map of risks and to elaborate a plan and present the plan. And once the plan is there, fine, we've done our project, and we're dealing with corporate social responsibility. So indeed, having a tool that can be used not only to measure the risk for the company, but the risk for human rights, the risk for the environment, the risk, and also a tool that will be able to measure how the community will see its best interest in the project. This is something that has to be at the heart also of these element of identifying how to prevent a negative impact. Lastly, it's also an element that will have to be taken into account upstream as well as the downstream of the intervention of a specific company. Examples of solutions of how to deal with these elements are, of course, notably when companies engage human rights impact assessments of their project prior to the project and while it is being taken into consideration, something that FIDH also does with affected communities through community-based human rights impact assessments for them to be able to build strategies and adapt their language to the company's language as such. The third element, and I will finish this, is the recourse mechanism that is being provided by the company to provide for the affected communities access to remedies in case of violations of rights. This is an essential element, notably in a context where those corporations will intervene in an environment where there's a lot of corruption, where the independent justice does not exist. We see throughout the world a real drawback on the rule of law, and hence when companies will have to be able to build and make sure that there are efficient recourse mechanisms, they will be proactive in defending mechanisms within which affected communities will be able to claim for their own rights. Voilà. So these three pillars are essential components which we look out for, notably at the European level when the draft directive is being discussed right now. The proposal on the table is clearly insufficient at the moment, and the European Parliament has made interesting proposals in that respect. We'll be able to follow up should anyone want to hear more about those. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antoine. Thank you very much for outlining the three pillars and also the, let's say, essential elements from your perspective with regard to due diligence. Now I would like to hand over to Vidya. And since Antoine also already mentioned tools on due diligence implementation, I think you are the perfect person to shed light on some of the developments in that respect as well. Vidya, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Axel, and to the previous speakers for having raised such relevant and valid points in the context of this debate. As ICL, we work with multi-stakeholder initiatives, otherwise known as sustainability standards or voluntary sustainability standards. And part of what I'm interested in sharing today are some of the debates that we've been having and picking up in the context of emerging due diligence, especially mandatory due diligence, and how sustainability standards should work in such an era. Also feedback that we've been hearing from many suppliers in developing countries, in supplier countries around what they're thinking. And finally, can the two work together? Can the smart mix of voluntary tools and mandatory tools really work well to be creating change? I think at the outset, one must say that from a voluntary sustainability standard or multi-stakeholder initiative standpoint, more due diligence and more legislation and policy measures around mandatory due diligence is a very welcome step. And that's because voluntary sustainability standards arose in a context of policy and market failure. Their genesis 25 years back was in the context of neither markets nor policies being able to actually hold business to account, but also integrate sustainability in business actions upstream and downstream. So from the point of view of ICL and its membership, I think these are very welcome moves. The key is, how do we make them impactful? How do we ensure alignment? How do we reduce duplication? How do we reduce the burden, I think, on a particular kind of actor or stakeholder? So some of what ICL is trying to do is really work in the context of this debate to improve collaboration, improve alignment, better definition, better definement of scope, so that at the end of the day, the intention of these policies is met. And this is important because if you look at the history of some mandatory due diligence measures, such as the UK modern slavery law, or for example, the Australian modern slavery law, well-intentioned legislation that came in to address human rights issues, the evidence is that 5 or 6 years down the line, they're not really meeting those goals. And the question is why? Is it that the law is weak, or doesn't have teeth? Is it that implementation is poor, or is it that the law alone is not enough? So I think it's really important to understand that even in an era where governments are raising the bar for business accountability, there is still a very important and valid role for voluntary tools. I think, as the previous speaker, Anton, said, I think due diligence has to be done well. And I think if due diligence is done well, most importantly, it can improve traceability, transparency, and I think a focus on root cause analysis. And for me, this point emerges from the realization that any human rights impact in any supply chain does not arise only because of what's happening at one point. It's not just the employer or just the supplier's failings that are to be taken into account. There is a structural and systemic nature to what results in human rights abuses, whether that's modern slavery, whether that's child labor, or whether that's poor occupational safety. Let's take the debate around living wages. Increasingly, people are saying don't focus just on wages, because an improvement in living wages should allow you to put in place measures that actually improve conditions of work, that actually improve the ability of people to not be put in situations of bonded and forced labor. So I think if done well, due diligence should help and enable people to adopt a shared responsibility approach, where across a supply chain, downstream and upstream actors work together to identify what are the root causes or structural issues at the heart of human rights violations and abuses, and collectively work to address them. From a developing country standpoint, from a supplier standpoint, the fear is that if the law is getting tighter, businesses are just going to look at risks and then cut and run. Right? And the key is we don't want that. We don't want that for trade. We don't want that for business, and we don't want that for development. So I think the nature in which the debate is taking place is very important, and it's important to let suppliers, let primary upstream producers know that this is not their burden. Meeting due diligence requirements is not their burden. They have a very important role to play in supporting shared responsibility, and I think capacity building, investing, and most importantly, calibration of expectations is really going to make the difference here. I think there are several challenges that we'll have to think about. Previous speakers have alluded to these. From a multi-stakeholder voluntary standard standpoint, I think a big fear we have is just a very disintegrated and duplicative approach to due diligence. If every single company out there, large company working in a supply chain, is going to want to take due diligence, the burden of those questionnaires, the burden of that data collection and auditing is going to fall on the supplier. We obviously don't want that. So I think ways in which there can be more aligned, integrated approaches, either through common standards or collective action at a sector level or supply chain level, will really be good. Interestingly, last December, ICL ran a workshop in India where we brought together several NGOs and voluntary sustainability standards organizations working at the field level in sectors such as textiles, agriculture, garments, and automobiles, and so on. And it was quite interesting. And it was a workshop on due diligence and what their thoughts were on emerging mandatory due diligence in Europe. And many of them said that there's almost an assumption that suppliers in developing countries don't abide by anything. Whereas actually over the years, there's been a lot of work to actually put processes in place. What's needed is actually a calibration of expectations between what does the law want, what do we already have in place, and where do we need more investment and where do we need more capacity building. So I think that's a really useful example to keep in mind, a point to keep in mind. I think just finally, a few final sort of thoughts from our side on the role that voluntary standards can play. As I said at the start, ICL takes the position that even in an era of mandatory due diligence, there's a very strong role for voluntary tools. Voluntary tools don't exist just to help businesses meet the legal minimum. That's not why they exist. They exist to help businesses go further. They help to exist businesses, be ahead of the curve, assess risks, or undertake measures which are anticipating what's going to happen 5 or 10 years down the line. And like I said at the start, it's really useful to look at voluntary and mandatory working together as carrot and stick, if you will, in terms of actually creating impact. Voluntary standards also, by virtue of the fact that they have been mainstreamed in many sectors, means that they have access to data. They can be good, I think, supportive partners to business. Due diligence to a large extent is about risk identification, prioritization, and mitigation. That needs data, that needs visibility. Many voluntary standards are set up to do this well. But I think it's very important then to not fall into the trap of seeing compliance with the voluntary standard as being a safe haven for compliance with the law. Because corporate accountability is corporate accountability. A company does have to take responsibility for its actions. And I think where voluntary standards can do well is be really clear, supportive partners to help put those processes in place or share that data or increase that transparency with companies that allows this sort of facilitative due diligence with stakeholder consultation, with participatory measures to actually be in place. I think in the interest of time, I'll leave it there. Axel, I know you wanted to leave some time for discussion. So just some quick thoughts from me, but for now, back to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Vidya. Thank you very much. That's excellent. Indeed, we are getting some questions in, and maybe want to go for a first question for each of the panelists, and actually want to combine a few of the elements which were already mentioned. Mr. Jorgensen very much stressed the importance of international trade to address poverty and the role of responsible business to conduct in there, and the different, let's say, approaches to due diligence. Mr. Madeleine also stressed that if you due diligence wants to work, it needs to be really well developed according to the 3 pillars you highlighted. And Vidya also already pointed a bit to the issue of cut and run, take the risk or lower the risks of certain suppliers when you are applying due diligence. And this all brings me to what are some of the implications for developing countries, especially the vulnerable countries, which are mentioned a lot in this summit. And how can we prevent that due diligence measures will not create exclusionary effects, which would hit the most vulnerable producers and the most vulnerable countries. There's also a question in that regard in the chat, which asks to which types of mechanisms can states cooperate to ensure that due diligence becomes an inclusive and strengthening tool for their trade relations rather than a trade barrier. And that all points to the question, how can we address possible negative socioeconomic effects of the implementation of due diligence measures? Because if we want to have them work, as you highlighted all, then we need strong tools, we need effective tools, and there will be a cost implication. And not all the costs should be borne by downstream actors in the supply chain, but there might be other ways we can think of in supporting them. And I would very much want to hear your thoughts on how to make this an inclusive process and which actors might play which role. Can I maybe first ask Mr. Jorgensen if he has some thoughts on that?
Indeed, thank you. It's a very important question, and of course, a very important first step is to talk together. So actually have the right actors at the table when we are discussing these things. So this is something that we actively pursue at the OECD, where responsible business conduct is an inclusive discussion that goes much beyond the membership of the organization. So we have many, you can say, lower and middle income countries also come to the table and discuss these things with the OECD membership. The second aspect, I think, is important that we have alignment around standards. The standards that we are discussing here today have been developed in a global conversation, and they contain the inclusive spirit and the principle pragmatism, and it's that baby that we have to not throw out with the bathwater, so to say. So avoiding a spaghetti bowl of different types of approaches, different types of regulation that somehow depart from these internationally agreed guidelines is going to be very important also for the predictability. And thirdly, I would highlight, Axel, that due diligence is about looking also at your own practices. It's not just about requiring things of other companies. So it is about looking at your business model, and it is a discussion also of how companies can design a business model that actually creates an enabling environment for their business partners to also deliver according to standard. And this is a discussion about the distribution of costs and benefits in the supply chain. And that can be a difficult discussion, but I think we need to remind ourselves that there's overwhelming evidence that if you are performing well on RBC indicators, ESG indicators, then you tend also to be a successful company. And that's what trade does. It makes companies more productive, and it challenges companies to meet higher standards. So this is the same in this area, but we need also companies, so to say, at the top of the supply chain to look at their own practices in addition to helping their business partners.
Thank you very much. Mr. Madeleine?
I sympathize with the questions, and I thank you very much for those questions, because I think they're at the heart of many obstacles we see in practice. I was mentioning in my introductions how human rights defenders are being attacked when they voice concern and when they want to echo the interests of affected communities. And quite often they're being portrayed as enemies to development, as obstacles to development. And so I think that we are at the heart of a problem that is being framed and used, in fact, to oppose and silence once more those voices. We have been, I'll give an example, and maybe this would be an illustration of how we can best answer this question. We've been involved in discussing with an oil extraction company who's been developing a project in Uganda, wherein they found oil and they use it, extract it, and sell it away. They did a human rights impact assessment of the project, asking a famous European agency to help them design this. And they consulted 4,000 people who were affected and relocated, I don't know how many, and so on and so forth. In doing so, human rights defenders who were criticizing the project, journalists who were criticizing the project, were the target of repression and being prosecuted. So what we realized when we investigated and engaged with the company is that what they had done in the first place was a ticking box exercise, that is to organize town hall meetings where they say, okay, this is going to be the problem, this is the project that we're putting forward. Fine, they've been consulted. And just by mentioning a project was a form of consultation for them. And so what we have done in reality was to make sure that these defenders be at the table with the oil extracting firm, so as to engage in a conversation, so as to better engage in the defense of the rights of the affected communities and make sure that those rights of those communities be properly addressed by the company. So in doing so, we've put up due diligence process. And in saying so, what we have done is used human rights. And we use human rights as an empowering tool for affected communities. And this is, in fact, my answer to the question on does it oppose development? I think it's the contrary. Due diligence provides a tool to companies to actually engage with the human rights, with the notion of an empowering community able to participate in discussions for its own future.
Thank you very much, Antoine. Vidya, you have some final thoughts on making the process more inclusive?
I mean, it's going to come down to business commitment to, what the business model is and what the trade-offs they're willing to, I think, negotiate are. I think one of the earlier speakers says this has to be about how business is done differently and not philanthropic or, corporate social responsibility motivations. We've recently been looking at, the feasibility of advancing living wages in a very challenging sector like tea in Northeast India, which is, as many of you know, sadly, where human rights violations and abuses are a serious risk. And on the one hand, when you talk about helping plantations and estates pay more wages, on the other hand, are international buyers willing to pay more for tea they buy? Who is actually going to walk the talk when it comes to actually creating more value and making sure that that value is actually being translated? So I think it's going to have to come down to commitment. And I think the sector approach is very critical. I think one thing that also we've learned is, as well-intentioned as an individual company is, they alone cannot do it, because the sector dynamics work in that way. You will be excluded, there will be ramifications, labor is mobile, and so on. So I think the sector approach and the value chain approach, and the ideal is where the two intersect. I think that would be very interesting to see. But yeah, I think it's time to see, which companies walk the talk and which ones are actually really going to integrate their value chain partners and suppliers to make that change.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Unfortunately, that's only what we have time for today. I think it was a great set of presentations, also highlighting some of the key challenges, especially I think with aligning different initiatives and different developments. There are some questions still in the chat which also point to that, and how can we have this, what I think Mr. Jorgensen called the spaghetti bowl of initiatives, and what also Vidya and Antoine point that we try to align, have a more coherent approach which really tries to achieve the aims which are embedded in this whole due diligence philosophy and also approach. I want to thank our panel members very much for their contribution today, Mr. Madeleine, Mr. Jorgensen, Ms. Rangan. Thank you very much for joining us today. We had a very large audience from different parts in the world, so I'm very happy to see such a big participation, and I want to thank all the participants very much. And finally, I want to thank our opening speakers, Dr. Court and Ambassador Borion, to setting the scene and also really framing our panel debate in a broader agenda. I want to thank you all very much. I wish you a nice afternoon, and I hope we can touch base on a future event in the near future. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Bye bye.